Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Pecan Street's Texas Clean Energy webinar. We're going to give everyone just a minute or two to sign on, and then we'll go ahead and kick things off. So sit tight for just 1 minute, and then we'll get started.
Then I'll lose the glasses.
Okay, we're right at 10:02, so I think we can probably go ahead and kick things off. I'm going to hand it over to Pecan Street CEO Suzanne Russo to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on Texas' unlikely leadership as a clean energy icon. I'm very excited about the speakers joining us today. They're going to help us understand how Texas ended up in this position as a clean energy leader globally, how we can build upon our leadership in this space for a stronger economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and what we think other states can learn from our experiences to accelerate their own transition to clean energy. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. A couple of housekeeping items first as we get going. All participants are muted, but we do want to hear your questions today. So for that, we'll be using the chat feature. That's the chat button on the lower portion of your screen. You can submit questions to individual panelists, or you can have them appear on the chat screen for all of the participants to see. Please feel free to send questions throughout the discussion. We'll stop periodically to try to address some of those as we have time. And if you didn't get an invitation to this webinar directly from Pecan Street, you can send an email to us at media@pecanstreet, all spelled out, .org to be added to our list. We also keep a running tab of all of our upcoming events on our website, pecanstreet.org. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Kirk Watson, who I'm sure many of you know, the former mayor of Austin and our region's former state senator. Senator Watson is now the founding dean of the new Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston, and he's also released a plan for Texas recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, a playbook for resiliency. I highly recommend everybody download that plan and read it. It's a great common sense approach to thinking about how we rebuild our economy in a way that creates opportunity for all Texans. I'm also very pleased to welcome today Commissioner Pat Wood, CEO of the Hunt Energy Network and former chair of both the Texas PUC and FERC. And Jim Marston is joining us as well. Jim Marston is also the chairman of Pecan Street's board of directors and one of the founders of our organization. Jim is vice president of public affairs for Environmental Defense Fund, which in addition to working on national and international environmental issues, Jim was heavily involved in the deregulation efforts here in Texas back in the late 90s. And we also will have Dr. Michael Weber joining us, although he is a little bit tied up at the moment. We think he'll be stepping in just a few minutes. Dr. Weber is Chief Science and Technology Officer at ENGIE and an author, a filmmaker, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and also one of our founders of Pecan Street and a member of our board of directors. So with that, we're going to dive in. The results of Texas' clean energy effort are fairly well known. Since we deregulated in 1999, Texas has become the world's 5th largest producer of wind energy. We have currently about 230,000 jobs in the clean energy sector here in our state. Those encompass everything from energy efficiency services to manufacturing of clean energy products, and exporting a lot of our knowledge around alternative fuel research and advanced power management and now electric vehicle production with the recent announcement of Tesla's move to Austin. Texas is also known nationally and internationally as a very business-friendly state. But these numbers didn't happen by accident. They're the results of an intentional effort and specific policies to help make clean energy a fairly competitive resource here in Texas. We're going to dive in now to a discussion to better understand how that happened and how we can move forward. Commissioner Wood, we're going to start with you. I think to understand I think to understand Texas' current leadership in clean energy, we really need to go back and understand the deregulation efforts that happened in 1999, which you were at the center of. Can you talk to us a little bit about why you thought deregulation would be good for Texas, and a little bit more about the context of that effort, as well as your role in it?
Thanks, Suzanne. It was about 25 years ago that I was interviewing with Governor Bush. He kind of pulled me out of obscurity and interviewed me for an open spot on the Public Utility Commission. And in an hour and a half, great conversation, which I was so impressed by, he kind of got to the end and said, you know, I asked him, why do you want to pursue deregulation? And he said, look, he said, you could get better prices, you can get better service, you can get better technology, innovation. But he said, at the end of the day, it's about the customer. And he said, the utilities care more about what we think, pointing at himself and the Senate and the House, than what their customers think. And that's wrong, and we're going to change that. So that kind of basically was my marching orders as a son of a small businessman. Of course, I love that. And jumped right in. And so we pursued in that legislative session a collaborative bill with the Senate and the House on wholesale competition. So that set up ERCOT, the ERCOT ISO, the wholesale market. The co-ops and the munis were big proponents and really helped construct that very collaboratively with the investor-owned utility. So that was the first step. In 97, Governor Bush had mentioned to me one day when I was in his office, I was walking out and he goes, Pat, we like wind. And I'm like, we like wind? All I could think of was California and Birkenstocks and Volvos. And I'm just like, really? And here I'm with my yellow power suspenders and tie and blue shirt. And I was just like, he goes, yeah, go get smart on it. So I went back and told Commissioner Judy Walsh about my conversation. And she said, well, we'll just have to get smart, won't we? So long story short, you know, coming from West Texas, obviously, look at the beautiful windmills behind you, Suzanne, on your backdrop. Those weren't there. There was nothing on the Texas landscape there at all. And in 97, we had an aborted bill for competition that had nothing about renewables in it. And then by 99, we had a comprehensive bill that really looked at everything about how to restructure the industry from a 20th century regulated industry to a 21st century competitive industry. And so the areas outside the cooperatives and municipalities were open to competition in 21. But a big part of that bill, and I'm going to give my friend Jim Marston the speak time on it, but was important to a number of constituents around the table, was that we do something for the environment. And so two aspects were in that bill. One was to clean up the dirty power plants, because we had at the time 3 or 4 of the top 10 dirtiest point emitting sources in the country. And those were coal-fired power plants that were owned by utilities here in Texas. And so there was an effort there to basically, if you clean up your power plant, you'll get your stranded cost money for that. So in other words, we'll make you whole for that because it's good for the customers and good for the public. And then the second thing was a small provision, which didn't have a lot of verbiage, thankfully, because it told the utility commission to go figure it out, which said we want to have 2,880 megawatts of renewable energy 10 years from now. So at the time we had 880. So in fact, we want 2,000 more megawatts of renewable energy. Well, now, as you all know on the phone, we're about an 80,000 megawatt market. So this was a small drop in the bucket, but it was a welcome mat from a bipartisan legislature and governor situation that, hey, Texas wanted this formerly discriminated against redheaded stepchild type of industry to be part of the family here. And so it was a welcome mat that, you know, got trampled on for about 20,000 for 30,000 megawatts more later. But it was a beginning, and it was really, I think, not so much that there was a lot of money in the renewable portfolio standard that came out of that, but that it was a big welcome mat that said this state is going to have streamlined generation interconnection. It's going to have streamlined and straightforward interconnecting with the grid. We have a robust grid at the time. It's since been augmented through the CREZ process. But This is a place where you're welcome. And with the retail deregulated market, you have a lot of individual customers you can do business with. In the early days, it was City of Austin, City of San Antonio, LCRA. I think some of the other munis and co-ops were the anchor tenants for a number of renewable investments, primarily wind in the state. But over time, it's become the military bases, the school districts, the big box retailers, the retail electric providers, and this whole heterogeneous market that allows for a lot of buyers and sellers to meet and to transact and do business. So, you know, I'd love to say, Suzanne, that we all thought this is how it would play out 25 years later, but for goodness sakes, it was throwing spaghetti at the wall and hoping it sticks on a number of things. And this was one that, boy, did it ever stick. And it's been a lot of fun to watch it play out.
It has been a really, you know, a game changer, obviously, in Texas and around the country and around the world as we think about how do we structure our utilities to enable innovation and affordability at the same time. So we're all very much grateful to you, Commissioner Wood, for shepherding that process and really making sure that it was constructed in a way that would produce these wonderful results. Because again, I don't think any of this happened by accident, which is why it's useful to really learn and understand our history as we think, particularly in this moment, about how to go forward. One of the things you said that I found very interesting, and I actually haven't heard before, is that you think it's a combination both of the deregulation of the markets combined with including the renewable portfolio standards and having those municipal and cooperative utilities that were allowed to persist that could serve as those first big customers, that it was a combination of those three things that really let wind energy take off in our state. Did I understand that accurately?
You did, and I think the important thing, and while it's not so dominant now, because there are now a lot of financial structures that allow in a largely energy-based, merchant-centered market for a project to get financed. At the early days, and again, we're talking 02 to 07, when we were still transitioning out of the regulated market in most of Texas, balance sheets of retailers were not what they are today. I mean, the Vistra and the NRG and Direct Energy, those guys were not at all robust, what you'd call robust. They were coming out of splitting up. And so having somebody with a strong balance sheet, which the City of Austin and City of San Antonio and LCRA, for three big ones, that was important to really jumpstart and I was involved in some of these as a developer for electricity, a wind developer in the mid-decade. Having those anchor tenants in place really did provide a lot of foundation for a future market that's much more heterogeneous. But it had to start sometime, and I do think that those early contracts with wind farms that the munis pursued here were pivotal to providing a foundation.
Great. Well, thank you very much again for that background. And I'm looking forward to talking with you more in a few minutes about your thoughts on how we can go forward, and also what other states, especially places like New York, that really are trying to experiment with that combination of market and regulatory policy development for clean energy, what they should be adapting from what Texas has had success with. But Jim, I think Commissioner Wood teed up our next question really well for you, which is, as he mentioned, EDF supported the deregulation bill, and you were really involved in making sure that clean energy got a fair shake in that process. Can you talk a little bit more about how that happened? You know, we hit those renewable portfolio standard goals about 15 years early. Where you think we could go from there, and yeah, just a little bit more context would be helpful. Thanks.
Well, as Commissioner Wood noted, there was an attempt to pass a bill in 1997 that failed, and it seemed pretty clear in 99 that the proponents of deregulation needed other political support. And we saw an opportunity to trade support for the bill for things we cared about. And the two things we cared about were cleaning up the grandfathered power plants and also getting a renewable portfolio standard. So we figured out what we wanted. We asked for it very clearly. We said, if we get this, we'll be for the bill. We did not waver. Some groups occasionally ask for something and then ask for something more. I think that's a terrible way to negotiate. And we didn't do that. We knew that what we wanted was cleaner air, and we wanted to jumpstart renewables, though in Texas at the time we knew it was going to be wind. And we bet that the technology would work, and we believe in the rules of economics, that economies of scale matter. And if you would build more, the cost of manufacturing as well as the cost of installation would go down, and we could drive down the cost of wind, not only in Texas, but in the country and around the world. I will say, I don't think this is bragging, though I am a Texan and I'm used to bragging, but it's not bragging to say that what we did in '99 jump-started the wind revolution in the world. And I'm really proud of that. Frankly, there are a lot of people who did some good things. I would say we had some really good legislators at the time. Senator Sibley and Steve Woolens, the chairs of the Senate and House committees, were spectacular.
Jim, do you think that we would have seen the same growth in wind energy over time without that renewable portfolio standard?
Well, eventually we would. Somebody else would have jump-started it. But we're a big market for electricity. And so a small percentage of a big number of generation in Texas is a big number. The 2,000 new megawatts that were in that bill was not really an accident. That's the number we asked for. We didn't brag about it at the time, but basically that was doubling the amount of utility scale wind that was in the country at the time. So we had a small number to affect the Texas market, but in terms of the total national number, it was a big deal.
And we now have about 28,000 megawatts of wind capacity here in Texas that I think everybody would argue has been great across the board for affordability, job growth, and resiliency. So is it fair to say that you think deregulation combined with the renewable portfolio standard really is the key to how Texas became a leader in clean energy, that it's the combination of policy creating that market and then having a business-friendly state?
Well, let's start with the number one thing is we had great resources. We have a lot of wind, okay? So God gave us good wind and good sun. We've been a little slower to take advantage of the sun, but we're coming. Number two, some people try to claim that it was just the market did it all. No, we had policies. And we had policies, both the legislative policies and frankly, the way the market was structured by the PUC, by Pat Wood, but frankly, our economist, Mark McLeod, was in there every day and got a market that worked, used prices the right way, competition the right way, and then also had a system where you had to comply or there was an automatic penalty. That was a really key part of that. And then finally, we did some things later on to make it better, like the CREZ, the lines, the transmission rules were also very smart, and that made it work as well.
Okay, thank you. Jim and Commissioner Wood, thank you for that background. That really sets up this conversation, I think, to be productive, talking about how we move forward. So I'm going to shift a little bit now to Senator Watson. We gave some stats a little bit earlier about clean energy jobs in Texas, and I think we actually pulled those from your playbook, which again, I can't recommend enough for everybody to read. It's hopeful and it's practical. But Senator Watson, I would really love it if you could talk a bit more about how you think economic resiliency and the clean energy resources and assets we have in Texas fit together as we go forward now. How much do you think clean energy should be a part of our state's economic recovery plan? And how do we do a good job at that?
First of all, thanks. And I love hearing Chairman Wood and Jim Marston talk about the history of this, because the work that went into getting us to where we are today was truly brilliant. And as they've pointed out, it set us up in precisely the right way. Having been in the Senate after all that passed, and actually having tried to do some things with the renewable portfolio standard that I thought would be an improvement on the renewable portfolio standard, when others were not as visionary, I don't mean by me, but as they were in '99 in the legislature, we hit some hurdles on some of that. But I really appreciate the work they did. Let me talk about the playbook that you keep mentioning, and I appreciate that. If anybody wants to look at that playbook, go to the Hobby School of Public Affairs website, and you'll find it there. But what the foundation of that is that with COVID, and frankly, the not so much COVID, but the drop in the price of oil and the impact that that's had on the state of Texas, that we're in a unique set of circumstances. Maybe never before, at least in our lifetimes, have we been in a situation where we get to take a pause and look at how things are working, or how they were working as a result of this shock, this economic shock that our system has been through. I know I've got a lot of friends here that are sports nuts, and I am too, and I keep referring to it as we're in a timeout, and it might be just because I don't get to watch enough sports, so that's what I keep thinking about. We're in a timeout. We've gone back to our corners, or we're in the locker room, or on the sidelines, and so now what we ought to do is we ought to analyze not how we try to recreate the past. Frankly, part of that past didn't really exist. We had the luxury of affluence, and were able to ignore certain things. But instead, what we do is we look, how do we come out of this, and in the new condition that's been created, where we're better and we have a more resilient economy. And Professor Stephen Pettigo at the LBJ School and I are the ones that wrote this playbook for resiliency. He's a professor there, and also directs their urban lab. And we gave 9 very specific things that we think ought to happen. But one of those is to basically double down on clean energy. And the statistics that you've talked about, being the 5th largest producer of wind in the world, right now between 16 and 20% of Texas's power comes from wind energy. When Marston says that this kind of set the course for the world, it's interesting. Texas companies produce about a quarter of the United States wind energy. So the goals that he was hoping to achieve, and that Chairman Wood were hoping to achieve, they've played out. Now, with regard to solar, and that's where I tried to change the renewable portfolio standard at one time to help jumpstart solar in that way. But there are over 680 companies in the state creating 10,000 jobs. So what should we do? The truth of the matter is that we're, because of the great background and work that's been done, we are leading. Texas leads in knowledge and production as a center for energy. So how do we then go further to develop that ecosystem so that we are more resilient when we come out of all of this? And we have a number of things. I'm not going to go through all of them, but this state, because it says it's business friendly, and it is, one of the things it does is it loves economic development incentives. Well, we ought to focus on how we provide those economic development incentives so that we have statewide clusters where we can incentivize more and more clean energy. We ought to ask our energy companies that are, Texas is the energy capital of the world in a lot of ways. We ought to work with them to create means and mechanisms for them to shift their energy research and expertise and use that established expertise to expand our market share with regard to renewables. This is still a relatively virgin territory that people we can make a lot of money in and do good at the same time. I think we need to start having statewide goals for energy efficiency, and that way it would create an incentive for clean energy to play a bigger role. That ought to include what we do with residential incentives and not just with commercial incentives. We've got a lot of people that are out of work right now. We ought to double down on our workforce training so that we train people. A lot of people lost jobs when the energy sector cratered on us, and shale, it wasn't what it was just a few years ago. Well, we got displaced oil industry workers. Let's train them to be a part of the clean energy sector. And then the final thing I'll say is we need to treat the alternative energy industry with the same respect that we provide to other Texas industries. While we have made real progress in Texas from '99 forward, we still have the old debates about how this is some sort of tree-hugging environmental movement, and we don't recognize, particularly at the Capitol, the jobs and the revenue and the prosperity that's created by this, and we need to be touting that, and then treat it like the industry that it has become, as opposed to being something to be pushed off to the side. I hear the discussion about the renewable portfolio standard and the role it played. I have kind of a cynical view based upon some of the people at the Capitol I worked with when I was a senator, that I think they thought that was, we'll put that in that bill because it'll never happen. Well, it really did happen. It really did happen. And now it's like, what do we do? Well, we need to double down on it. Maybe not on the portfolio standard itself, but when I say double down, I mean in terms of recognizing this as a winning industry.
Because clean energy is a global future, so we can be certain that there will be jobs and economic opportunities in that sector.
Well, and it's proved itself. One of the things, it's been mentioned, I think, by both the chairman and Jim, the building of the CREZ lines. Well, that was a direct follow-up. That commitment was a direct follow-up to the work they did on so-called deregulation. Texas has not done a very good job when it comes to providing infrastructure in our state. I can go all day long. I can filibuster on how bad we do with infrastructure. But the CREZ lines are an example of where they followed up and recognized the jobs and the money that this could create, and they went ahead and made that investment. The state did. Well, we need to continue that recognition because, yes, we could be a world leader. We are a world leader, but we could do even more. And I think it would provide us with resiliency in our economy to avoid the kind of shocks that we're feeling right now.
That's a wonderful point. I want to come back to the whole panel in just a few minutes with some questions about energy affordability and equity, particularly given all the points that you made about the number of people that are out of work in Texas right now. Prior to the pandemic, we were already at a 15% poverty rate in our state. So figuring out how we create a more resilient economy while keeping life affordable for Texans is something I hope to discuss with you all before we close today. But Dr. Weber, I think this is a good point to move over to hearing from you a bit about how you think Texas can leverage our current position and all of the assets and knowledge that we have to really become a global exporter of clean energy and really turn this into the kind of significant economic sector that Senator Watson and I think everybody else on this panel believes that it should be in the next handful of years. So two-part question for you. Do you think the global energy industry is really ready for a massive growth in non-fossil fuel energy? Great. And then the second part is, how far ahead of other states or countries is Texas in being able to go after this as a driver of our economy for the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Great questions, and my dogs might bark, so they might join the conversation. We'll see how it goes. First of all, I think the energy sector is expanding the range of things it seeks to produce and provide beyond the conventional fuels. There are now more options and more technologies and more solutions. The energy industry sees this basically up and down the industry. The largest multinational oil companies are getting into carbon capture and sequestration and wind farms and that kind of thing. And I see it in a dual role as a professor at UT, but also at ENGIE, a company headquartered in Paris, France. So the transition is upon us. There are a variety of reasons for this. One is the customer wants it, the employees want it, the shareholders want it. The sector, the oil and gas sector in particular, has performed very badly from an investor perspective for the last 10 years. And so the oil and gas companies realize to get investor money, they'll have to add some more arrows in their quiver. So the transition's happening. And Texas is in good position. Texas is in a leadership position, as you heard from the other speakers. We are a leader in many ways, especially when it comes to deployment at scale, market development. We're a leader on technology. We are a laggard on some policy issues, but as you heard from Senator Watson and others, we're a leader on some policy issues as well. When I look back at how we got to where we are in Texas, and just to give my perspective, I think Texas will lead and should lead and will make a lot of money from leading this energy transition. There are 7 ingredients I have on my little list for why we led so far. And one is to double down on what Jim Marcy said, we have the resource. Why is Texas an oil and gas leader? Because we have a lot of oil and gas. Why are we a renewables leader? We have a lot of renewables, and wind and solar are the obvious ones, but we have a lot of geothermal. We have a lot of places to sequester carbon dioxide. We have a lot of other resource that we can deploy for this. There are places like New England that don't have a lot of oil and gas. They're not oil and gas leaders. So the resource really helps, and it starts there. And not only do we have a lot of wind and solar, but we have a lot of wind and solar on cheap, flat land, which is important because there's a lot of wind in the Rocky Mountains where it's harder to build, or in California where it's not cheap. So the fact that our land is flat, windy, sunny, and affordable is really important. So that number one is a resource. Number two, we have a cultural ethic to make money from our land. It used to be from cotton or other crops or cattle, and now it's from energy, whatever. So we just like to make money from our land. That cultural ethic is important. And by the way, that's in contrast with countries like Poland or France, which also have resources, frankly, but don't have the spirit of making money from the land. They make money in other ways. A third piece is on energy. We have a pro-infrastructure view. So Senator Watson said we lag on infrastructure. That's true in many ways. But on energy infrastructure, we tend to be a little faster than other states, especially say California or Europe. That is an issue because it meant we could build the CREZ lines. CREZ means competitive renewable energy zone lines, but also it might mean we need to build pipelines for carbon dioxide, other things to build it. A fourth is our technology. We have companies like Dell and others that are world leaders in technology, and technology enabled these rapid markets, these dynamic markets with sub-minute clearing prices, this kind of thing require technology. We're a great technology leader, that helps. We have entrepreneurship as a fifth point and can-do spirit. Certainly in Austin as an ecosystem for entrepreneurship, and Joseph Kopser and other entrepreneurs have launched their innovation and startups for mobility that helped get Tesla or the people to follow. But it's not just Austin and tech, it's also Houston with oil and gas companies and service companies, that kind of thing. We have a legacy of expertise. Senator Watson mentioned this, that we have a legacy of expertise, and that really helps. That means we have knowledge centers at the University of Houston, but also at the University of Texas, we have the EER degree, a master's degree in energy and environmental resources, the first degree in America, to my knowledge, that has energy in the title, which I think is very important. And then the last point, the seventh point, is we actually have great collaboration between state and local leaders. So certainly at the legislature, at the PUC with Pat Wood and with Senator Watson, but we also had at the local leadership with the munis, the municipal utilities in Austin and San Antonio, especially Austin, created the demand for green energy. And Austin Energy helped lead the way with some of these early deals in the late 90s, early 2000s. And again, Dell is a major customer for clean energy. So those are ingredients for success, by the way. So like it's the resource, the making money from the land, the can-do spirit and entrepreneurship, pro-infrastructure technology, knowledge centers, the culture, the education, as well as the collaboration between state and local level. I worry that we lost some of our state and local collaboration. We need to regain that. But basically, those ingredients are still in place for the clean energy revolution, so to speak. So now we'll make money from these other pieces. So that's kind of my view. I feel like the transition's happening. Texas is well positioned. It's not a slam dunk. If we sit idle, other states or other countries will beat us. I don't really think we're competing with Oklahoma as much as we're competing with England or something like that, or Australia. We could be a global scale competitor, but we got to get the collaboration in place. That's one that feels like it's operating more slowly today than a couple decades ago.
Mm-hmm. And so this is a question for the whole panel. And Michael, thank you for those thoughts. That was very clear. So if we want to move forward and everybody agrees clean energy is a good opportunity for us to double down and really grow our economy and create a lot of new jobs fast with certainty that that's going to be a reliable, constant source of economic opportunity and innovation. So to do that, to move forward, if we're learning from the past that we talked about a little bit earlier, we need a policy framework that's going to really enable this market to grow. Job training, for example, that Senator Watson talked about. There's got to be some kind of role that our state government leads in creating that. So if you were talking to legislators with our state government today, what would you want them to do? What would be your recommendations for how to get the right policy in place to let the market explode in a good way?
So maybe I'll go first, and the smarter people can correct me who know more about policy. I think we've had a great success story with the markets, as Jim mentioned, but it wasn't markets alone. Smart policy really helped facilitate and create the markets. And anything we can do with policy to create more markets and to fill the pipeline with innovation would be great. So there are other markets we can do. We can create more effective water markets, carbon dioxide, other markets. So it was your dog this time, not my dog. So more dogs will join
Really
in.
excited about that.
Yeah, we can create more markets with policy and create clear rules and create dynamic markets. The other thing is filling the pipeline of free enterprise. And I think the way you do that is with a very R&D focused policy. I'm an R&D guy. I believe in research. And I think that Texas really lags other states or countries when it comes to investment R&D. California and New York invest much more in R&D at the state level than Texas does. Texas invests almost zero on R&D. And the thing about R&D is it will generate some ideas that will then become useful for the markets. The markets have to exist as well. So we can use policy to really fill the pipeline of innovation and create the marketplace for the innovation to take hold. And then the last policy I'd recommend, where I feel like Texas really lags, is around building efficiency and energy efficiency codes. There's an opportunity. We don't really have statewide building codes, but maybe we should or could, that prioritize not just fire safety, but energy efficiency, and that helps create a new market as well.
And what I would add to that is a very practical, having just left, being in the Senate, and the very practical thing is that you have to focus it on jobs, and frankly, money. And this next legislative session in particular is going to be one where there's going to be a scramble because we're going to be broke. We're going to be broke in part because of the price of oil and the impact that's had, and of course, COVID. So being able to create a framework like Professor Weber talked about within the context of the sole goal being jobs and money at a time when that ought to be a huge focus of the legislature is going to be very important. And the other thing that has to be understood is that there will be a learning curve. There will be a learning curve on all of this. And so patience will need to be taken to make sure that people have the time to learn it, and it's done in a way where they can learn it. And then the final thing I'll say is there is a Senate. I'll go back to what I said in my original comments. There remains somewhat of a cynicism. It's not what it was back in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, when this first started. And so it's going to require using the moment we're in to create the focus that this can be part of creating a more resilient Texas and put people back to work.
Commissioner Wood, did you have a thought you want to share on that?
I do. There was a question online here from Mr. Martin, Michael Martin, and I think I want to emphasize that point is the thing that changed from when we started this to now is that the economics of renewables are the best of all the resources, unsubsidized, and we're still being subsidized, so they're even better now. But even with the subsidies gone, solar, particularly central, big solar out in West Texas, and large wind farms because of their unit costs, those two resources are better than a brand new gas plant. And we know you can buy gas, people pay you to take their gas, and it's still cheaper because of the capital cost of the equipment. That's a big change. And that's what, we're benefiting from that today in the competitive market. So it's going to be hard to say we need to throw money at these industries. What Kirk's mentioning and Michael were both eloquent, but way more than I could be, is how do we get the connection between the economic development, which I tell every regulator in the country, fundamentally, that's what your job is about for your state, getting those jobs and building that sound foundation for infrastructure and for business and for jobs and for families to thrive for decades to come. If a regulator's not doing that, he or she's not doing their job. But how do we make that connection between this great low-cost resource that doesn't need to be larded with a whole lot of extra love from the federal or the state government, but how do you connect that to the jobs that are going to be persisting jobs that look a lot like the wonderful jobs that Midland and Odessa and Beaumont, Port Arthur have had for my lifetime? We can do that. And I think the type of things that, I've read Kirk writing about, and what Michael just mentioned here, and what Jim Marston's been embracing for as long as I've known him, if not longer, that connection can happen, but it's got to start, and it's got to be loud leadership. Because again, like I mentioned, it was the welcome mat that got thrown out as much as the money that came from the renewable portfolio standards. So people pay attention to this. They pay attention, as Tesla did. They pay attention to what people are saying as well as what they're doing.
Jim, any thoughts that you want to add about what you would like to see the Texas legislature do to really expand this sector in our economy?
It would be not only the legislature, but the PUC and ERCOT. We still have some economic distortions in the market. We claim we're from market, but we have massive subsidies for things, particularly in fossil fuels, that don't need that anymore. They're 100-year-old programs. We also fail a test that Adam Smith had when he told us about how to do economics, which is you're supposed to put all the production costs into the cost of the product. Instead, we hide things like the effect of power plants on water. We need to recognize that air pollution and consumption of water in a state that has real limits on water are not fully being realized in the cost of fossil power plants. And if we did that, we would actually see that the renewable plants are even less expensive vis-a-vis the competition than they appear to be now. And that would really jumpstart even more renewable investments.
Can I say one other thing about what both the chairman and Jim have said? Well, I actually have two. One is Marston has taught me over the years, going all the way back to the early 90s when I was chair of what was then known as the Texas Air Control Board. Marston has caused me to always think in terms of what policy can we put into place where we'll end up with no regrets. In other words, set aside the debate and the argument about who might be right, but what policies could we put into place so that regardless of who's right, when it's said and done, we've benefited, and so we have no regrets. Or another way of looking at it is, you know, you don't end up in a situation where you've done nothing or you've taken a policy position that later you might regret it if it is the wrong one. This is a no regrets policy. Doubling down on this is the kind of thing that all it does is create more jobs, it creates more wealth, it creates more prosperity, and by the way, it does well with the environment. So it's a no regrets policy, and that's one of the ways that I think the legislature, the PUC, and ERCOT ought to be thinking about this. And then the final thing I'll say about that, and just part of what the chairman said, is, you know, how beneficial this is, even if you set aside the subsidies. One of the talking points for those who don't, for whatever reason, like clean energy at the legislature is, well, this is a subsidized industry and it wouldn't do that well if it didn't have the subsidies. Ignoring, by the way, all of the subsidies and the costs that Jim has also talked about of other energy industries. Ignoring all of that, but at the same time, there's a lack of understanding. And so that message that Chairman Wood is talking about the benefit, the economic benefit, even without the subsidies, has to be something that's foremost in our discussion about the no regrets policy.
And we've heard quite a bit about the importance of leadership in this space to put out that welcome mat, just to send the signal to the market, which will then come and grow here in Texas. And I completely agree, this is a no regrets policy. But when you have a dominant political ideology that seems to think any policy is bad, how do we get the kind of leadership that you guys are talking about? Where does that come from? Question to anybody.
Today is election day.
Yeah.
Elections matter.
Elections matter because policies matter, and in electing people who believe policy could play a constructive role is important. And I think it would be silly to think that policy does everything. It doesn't. Policy facilitates other things such as markets or cultural attitudes and behaviors and that kind of thing. So there's a role for policy, which is not zero. It's not 100%. And I think that's important. I do think that what Senator Watson said earlier about the emphasis of policy should be on economics for Texas. So another place you might focus on the environmental impacts in Texas, you focus on the rural economic development or the wealth creation or job creation. There are ways to show how policies can trigger the things we care about. You need to figure out what everyone's motives and incentives are and design policies that meet those motives and incentives. That's the way to go.
You know, one thing that I've been thinking about, when I drove back through downtown Houston the other day, and I thought about life in the post-COVID world, and I wonder if there'll ever be another skyscraper built in Houston, maybe even in America. And so it kind of led to a kind of a thought project, which wonderful having my college kids home, because I get to get them to start thinking instead of just playing soccer all day long. But I said, what else is going to change? And so you think about, this is a real interesting cusp opportunity for even a low policy kind of state like we are right now to rethink some things on I'm going to be as granular as building codes, but that's a good one that certainly has energy efficiency and clean energy impacts that we, Austin has done beautifully on that, but the rest of the state's been kind of slow to get there. But there were some major steps made in the Bush years on kind of having a standard building code that nobody had a lot of trouble with. So it's just kind of slowly been ratcheted over the years to make for more efficiency. So are there broader things that we can rethink, that the world will never be the same after COVID because of office space, or because of commuting, or because of travel, or because of how work teams interact? I mean, and I don't know where to go with that, but I know that this is that time. This is that time when everybody's putting all their presuppositions in a little bit of a questionable state and willing to rethink the model. So I wish I was the one able to think it through, but there are people on this call and people out and about who I think can contribute to that. But this is the time to do it, more than any that I've seen in my life.
Just a quick question, maybe yes or no to each of the panelists. Do you think it's possible to get to 100% clean energy in Texas, say in the next 15 years, while keeping energy rates affordable, some of the lowest in the country?
Yeah, 100%.
Mhm.
Define clean and define affordable, but then if you have less flexibility, yeah. So if natural gas is part of the solution, that helps facilitate a faster transition, and natural gas helps keep prices low and lets things go faster because we have the infrastructure. But then you have to think about carbon capture or other solutions or negative carbon somewhere else. 15 years is pretty quick. It's not impossible. Usually the way you accelerate is by investing more money. So if that's the pressure on rates. If you give yourself 20 or 30 years, probably it's a smoother glide path. Having said that, there's a lot of stuff that's going to retire in the next decade or so. We have an opportunity right now.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say the fact that the market is, as we saw in the last couple of years, the market closed down a significant amount of coal plants, which were the ones that didn't take the bribe from the Senate Bill 7 in 99 and got paid their stranded costs to clean up. So those are now gone. So it took a while. That's 20 years after they were first fingered. But I think given a little bit longer runway, the market will shut things down because there's nothing in the queue. There might be a gas plant or two in the queue, but there's no coal, no new nuclear in the queue at all. It's all wind and solar and a lot of storage. And one of the questions pointed out the need for long duration storage. I do think the market signals are starting to be sent for that, but much like the different solar technologies in 2008 before the economy crashed during that recession, there were a lot of great ideas other than solar PV, the tried and true solar, that just never came back. So that we've got to see if storage has the ability to make it through this recession for something other than batteries. But certainly storage is going to have to be broad and deep to facilitate 100% wind and solar. And again, I support what Michael said earlier about geothermal, and if we can do carbon capture as an offset so that you can net out to 100% clean energy, fine. But I've always just thought if we got to 80%, that's I'd give that kid an A. Nobody dreamed we'd ever get over 30, and we're there now. So 50's likely soon, in the next 5 or 10 years. I think getting above 70 is going to be a push, just electrically, but never say never. But 100 is tough, but I can certainly see being much more dominant, doubling what we have now, just because that's what we've got in the queue.
Michael asked the question, what do we mean by clean? If we include existing nuclear and we can keep it going without building new plants, they're going to be too expensive or appear to be too expensive. Plus the innovations in storage, I do think it's possible to get to 100%. 2030, I don't know, but 2040 for sure. And we can do it at where prices are going to be pretty comparable to where they are now, maybe plus inflation.
And this might be a question for you, Michael, or Commissioner Wood. Do you think we need additional transmission infrastructure to enable that transition? Is that something the legislature could perhaps be looking at in the upcoming session for job growth as well?
I've been a big transmission component my whole career. Never really saw a transmission line I didn't want to permit or get built. But I do see the grid, and this from Pecan Street, Suzanne. I think the grid is really pushing outward. You hear the word edge, and I kind of tend to, I'm commissioning a battery this week in West Texas, so I really am on the edge of the grid. But, when you think about pushing it toward the customer premises, I do sense that maybe much like the days of like I mentioned, the big commercial office buildings are probably over. The age of the big gas plants and coal plants are done. Maybe the age of the great big backbone transmission is done. I think CREZ was what we had to do was the right thing to do, and obviously jump started a lot. And ERCOT is moving forward with projects to beef up the collection to the solar areas and, you know, out toward Big Bend and what have you. So I think the ongoing transmission process is probably adequate, but, you know, I could be convinced otherwise.
I share Commissioner Wood's support for transmission lines. I think it's the backbone infrastructure we need. I think, however, the really big overhead ones that spark wildfires or block views and degrade property values because they're ugly might not be the future. Underground high voltage DC lines that are much more expensive to build, but much cheaper to maintain, need narrower right of ways, don't block the view, look more like pipelines. You don't even know they're there until you're standing right on top of them. And they facilitate a lot of renewables integration. I think we're going to need something like that. I think we're also going to need the rise of microgrids. The thing is, if we electrify a lot of the things we do with heat today, which could be vehicle, transportation, some industrial load, which are served by heat by burning gas or steam and that kind of thing. If we increase electrification, we're going to need more electricity, which means there's room for a lot of growth in microgrids as well as growth in transmission. In that transmission might need to grow even more than we would have expected. As we go to variable renewables, they have lower capacity factor, they're farther away. That means more miles of wires, more voltage miles. And so I think there's an opportunity to build more stuff. And as we build more stuff, it generates money at the time of construction. It generates value for the decades of their use. It helps us clean up the grid. So I'm very pro transmission, and this gets me crosswise with a lot of environmental groups. But I think there's a way to do it that's smarter than the way we do it today, at least in terms of impact.
Great, thank you. We just have a couple minutes left. I'd like to give you each time to make a closing statement, any point that we didn't have a chance to get to. Senator Watson, let's start with you.
Well, I guess all I would say just very quickly is that this is the kind of thing we need to be doing where we create the focus. I saw one of the questions, the Q&A was kind of taking me to task on my saying that it's about jobs, 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 money, money, money. And they're saying, what about clean, clean, clean? Sure. That's part and parcel of it, but I must admit that I kind of play into the current environment, and that includes the political environment, where I think we have an opportunity, and that opportunity is at a time when so many people are out of work, and we need to have a focus on how we come back economically, and that's what the legislature is going to be looking for. That we have this unique opportunity that will result in clean, clean, clean. And so I like the focus of the question, and I like the focus of what people are talking about here. We have an opportunity that I hope we don't waste.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about issues in a way that win, win with no D. I think it's quite all right to use other words if you get climate policies. We didn't talk about global warming when we were trying to get the RPS added to the deregulation bill. We talked about diversity. We talked about not sending money to Wyoming to pay for coal. And what we got was a policy that got massive amounts of CO2 out of the air in our state and around the country. So I like talking in ways that are effective.
Thank you. Commissioner Wood, any final thoughts?
You know, one is just as a native Texan, I think I've always, and I grew up in Port Arthur, so I got to see and taste and smell what it is that makes our economy run firsthand. But I've always kind of mentioned in speeches about Texas that the 20th century, God gave us a lot of stuff underneath the earth to monetize and make money in the energy industry. And the 21st century is when we do it from what he gave us above the earth. And so I'm looking at the wind, looking at the solar. Geothermal actually goes back in the earth. So we got that covered, Michael. We'll hold that one forward. But there's a real Texas, it's not old energy and new energy, it's energy. And if we've gotten smart enough and the economics have proven that it's cheaper and better, we don't have to change paradigms. We just have to do what we've always done, which is take the best the best economics and the best resource and convert it into jobs and money. And one of the aspects of that is this question that Kirk responded to, is the nice benefit of doing the jobs and the money angle is you get the clean angle, but we got to consciously do it. And so I'm, big fan of policies, and policies that don't put a big price tag on the back of people, but put out welcome mats and point directions. I think those kind of policies should work in a Republican Austin as well as a Democrat Austin. And certainly in my day in the bipartisan Austin, they work beautifully.
Thank you. And Michael, we'll close with you.
Just think that there's an opportunity here, and it can hit a lot of check boxes for a lot of people around rural economic development, economic growth, cleaning up the environment. But it's going to take a collaborative spirit, repeating what I said earlier. I think we got the right ingredients. Let's just follow the right recipe.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us today on this webinar. Thank you again to our speakers. I really appreciate your time and insights. We recorded the webinar. It'll be up on Pecan Street's YouTube channel tomorrow if you want to share it. And I hope everybody gets out and votes today if you didn't already.
Be
Take
safe.
care, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.